The title of my talk is Things I've Come to Believe. And just to make it super dramatic, I said the battle for simpler code. That doesn't necessarily mean anything, but it sounds good. Let me sell you on my site real quick. It takes 30 seconds. Just deal with it. I run a business called Laracon. It's specifically for basically every single person in this room. So, there's lots of these sites these days. When I was learning this stuff, there was nothing, right? It was crap. It was so hard to figure this stuff out. Now there's tons of resources, but a lot of it is tailored for, learn how to make a website, learn how to write CSS. So Laracon is specifically for people who already have a job, but as we all know, there's so much to learn. You don't stop learning. We're going to talk about that a lot. So yeah, if you have time, check it out. I'm just going to put this slide up here real quick. Do me a favor. Look up from your phones, look up from your computers, read this over and over and over. Now, the website says it takes 60 seconds, so just keep looking at that and reading it and reading it. And then if you go home and you feel compelled to sign up for a site, that would be awesome. I'm not going to judge you. Just go ahead and do it. It does take 60 seconds, so this is awkward. Hey. Okay. I think that's growth hacking. I'm not sure. You're going to see some recurring themes in this presentation. 3 things. 1, care. Easily, when we talk about Laravel, the thing that most attracted me to it is this idea that an immense amount of care was put into it. And I think most people would agree. 2, simplicity. Simplicity is a metric that we just don't talk about enough. We're very interested in design patterns and principles and architecture, and that's great. These are wonderful things, but simplicity is a very important thing that we just don't seem to give much weight to. That's incredibly important. And then finally, distrust. I think distrust is actually a healthy thing for us. If you're on Twitter and if you're like me, you're just inundated with people telling you this is the way forward. You need to use this acronym or this architecture style or this tool or this new framework. It's overwhelming, right? And it's the reality is you can't learn all of it. So we have to have a healthy level of distrust. When somebody tells you you need to learn this tool, take it in, consider it, but don't necessarily immediately adopt it. I sometimes compare it to sand. If you were to take a scoop of sand on the beach, most of that sand would come through your fingers, right? But some of it would stay. And I think that's kind of a good way to think of code. So yeah, when somebody tells you this is the way forward, just have some distrust. Take it in, but have some distrust. Okay, things I believe. What's unimportant is paramount. I have this hanging in my office. This is one of my favorite quotes. What exactly does that mean? It just means it's very simple. The things we think don't matter maybe matter the most. It's very interesting. We'll talk about that a little bit. Next, simpler always wins. And I say simpler because the reality is what would be considered the simple solution very much depends upon what you're building and the context. And Konstantin did a very good job of talking about that. So we'll kind of talk about what that means. Generally, it means the tool that's easiest to consume and the easiest to kind of figure out is usually the one that becomes more popular. So I think when I'm building my own open source projects, what are some of these qualities that I can kind of steal from the projects I like, whether it's the Faker library or some of the Laravel components? How can I kind of steal these things and work them into my own projects? Next, going in line with that. This very much goes in line with that. This idea that we should favor the API over purity. If you're anything like me, you're trying to figure out how to use a tool, you go to GitHub, you go to the README, and it's you can't figure it out. And I've been doing this for 10 years, and I still, you're reading the README, and it's I don't even, show me the hello world, I can't figure this out. You're telling me to new up 6 different objects and it's complicated and hard? That's very frustrating. So in these situations, I feel they're favoring maybe architecture or purity, we would sometimes say, over the user. And I feel the user should come first every single time. Next, be honest about scope. This is a great one. It's important. We always end up battling on Twitter. So if you're on Twitter, you see these battles take place. And once again, Konstantin kind of pointed out that sometimes we're battling, but we're coming from vastly different perspectives. I'm working on this small thing. You're working on this large thing. The requirements are are completely different, yet we act like they're the same. And the worst thing is when we say, this way that I'm doing it is the way that this junior developer, this guy working on his first blog, should write his project. And that's when it gets kind of tricky. Next, focus on the fundamentals. Story time. So actually, I've only been coding since I was like 19. That's when I got started into it. I wish I was the 12-year-old. You know, a lot of 12-year-olds will follow me on Twitter, and I'm just so impressed by them because they will be so far beyond me by the time they're 30. So that's great. But no, when I was 12 years old, the plan was to be a guitar player. I was going to be the rock star, right? I went to a music school. I played 5 hours a day. I went to college on a music scholarship. By all accounts, that was the plan, right? And then I decided I'd like to make money, so I switched to programming, right? But when I was studying guitar, and I did this seriously, I wasn't just some kid in a garage. I did this seriously, right? Well, I loved rock, so I would play along with like AC/DC, and AC/DC I think is one of the best bands ever, by the way. We'll talk about that more in a second. And I would play along, but I wasn't quite good enough to play like Angus does. But that's okay, because you just turn the distortion a little bit higher, and it muddies up the notes so you can't hear how off you actually are. But yeah, I would do that for years, and I got better and better and better. And then at one point, and I wasn't calculating when I did this, but at one point, I went back, and I started focusing on the fundamentals of guitar and music. Because most of us don't. You learn the basics, and then you immediately move on, and you want to do the flashy stuff, right? But I went back, and I focused on even something as simple as playing a scale, but playing it perfectly. Playing it where there's not an ounce of noise between every single note. This is actually very difficult, and most beginners never actually learn how to do that. They just learn the notes, and then they move on to the next thing. And what I found was, when I went back to these fundamentals, it made me a significantly better guitar player. And I found the exact same thing is true with code, where sometimes we want to learn all of these fancy things, and it's cool, right? Everyone in this room, we're here because we love this industry, and we love learning new things and new ideas and new concepts. But from my experiences, sometimes it's better to not learn that new, cool thing and go back and focus on the fundamentals of writing clear, simple code, the fundamentals of writing database design, right? These are things we sometimes learn but never fully learn. So I think there's a lot of value in that. And then finally, things I believe, let's just build things. So often we are, I'm going to say we, but I assume you feel this way. We're terrified to release code because some jerk on Reddit is going to make you feel like crap because he's decided, well, in this book on page 122, it says you shouldn't do this thing, and you did that thing. So I'm going to call you out on it, right? And so you're kind of terrified to release your code. This whole concept of imposter syndrome, which Jessica, it was an amazing talk, which she talked about, it all kind of relates to this. So yeah, and here's a picture of Angus Young. This is how cool he is in front of 100,000 people. I'm just going to let you look at that. He lives in the Netherlands. I'm not sucking up or anything, but anyways. Okay, yeah. Writing software has become really hard. And I think we've learned that in the last couple of days because many speakers have referenced it. Really hard. And I don't say this to complain. I don't say this to whine. It's just a reality. It is overwhelming when you think about how many things we have to learn. I'm going to show you. But excluding this conference, which was very nice, in general, we just don't talk about it very much. You know, we talk about ideas. We talk about culture, but we don't just talk about the fact that it's so much to learn. And maybe I'm exposed to this a little more because I run Laracon, and I'm always talking to people who are just now breaking in to the industry, and I'm seeing what they, and you know, we have the tendency to forget just how hard it really was. And when I think about it for myself, if I knew how deep the rabbit hole actually goes in terms of what you have to learn, I'm not sure I would do it again because I've been doing it for 10 years right now, every single day, and I still am very aware of how much I just don't know anything about. It is a ridiculously tough industry. So I think we're all just kind of quietly overwhelmed, right? We all feel like the dog who has no idea what he's doing. And what's funny is you laugh, this has been around for years, right? You laugh because it's completely true. We all just kind of feel that. And we represent that we know everything, right? but we really just have no idea what we're doing. If you work in one area of a business and this is your area of focus, you can probably tackle that. But especially for those of us who are just doing everything ourselves, or you're trying to go out on your own, you have to know how to do everything at this point, and that's really tough. And the tough part is, as much as we feel this way, and everyone laughing feels this way, right? We have it in our heads that everyone else just knows everything they're doing, right? They're doing perfect TDD or BDD. They're taking it slow. They're doing it right. It's just perfect, right? And no. From what I've heard and from what I've talked from the people I've talked to, no, these people, whether they admit it or not, at some point just feel exactly like this. Because it's impossible to know it all. It's just impossible. And the worst part is, we can be honest with our friends and with our team members, but especially when you go to a conference and you're talking to people you don't know, you sometimes have this, I don't know, we shouldn't do it, but sometimes you feel like you need to blend in. And when everyone is talking about this general concept, well, you can't be the only one who doesn't know what it is, right? So what you have to say is, why, of course I'm familiar with temporal databases. I only use it every day, right? Yes, I'm totally with you guys on this conversation, right? It reminds me of Homer.
Now we're going to run a few tests. This is a simple lie detector. I'll ask you a few yes or no questions, and you just answer truthfully. Do you understand?
Yes.
Right? I feel that way too much. I hate it. But if you think about it, I'm not sure it was always this way. It definitely wasn't all this way in the web world. At one point, HTML and CSS were learnable. You couldn't do much. It didn't have any behavior, but you could figure it out, right? It was kind of a crappy site, but we all did it. You could do it. But now, it's a little bit different. I prepared for this, so get ready. We have a few slides to cover. Yes, we have to learn HTML and CSS, right? It's the bedrock. Okay, we can do that. But you know what? CSS is actually frustrating, and when you just want a grid that works in every single browser, it might be nice to use a framework. So let's figure out Bootstrap and Foundation. You'll probably toy around with both. Okay, but wouldn't it be nice if we could have includes and variables in our CSS? It doesn't support that natively, or at least not in a way that we can use right now. So let's figure out Sass, Less, or Stylus, or something else that's coming up soon. Cool. But you know what? It would be cool if we could have a little bit of behavior, right? So we need to figure out JavaScript, but JavaScript kind of sucks. It's way better now than it was back in the day, but back in the day, it was just frustrating, right? So we're going to do that. Okay, cool. But now I'd like to be able to change things and have them reflected on my server, but we don't even really know what a server is just yet. We'll get to that in a minute. So we need to learn Ajax, but you know what? Just Ajax, vanilla Ajax, especially 2008 Ajax, whoo, hard stuff. So you know what? Why don't we learn a framework like Vue.js or Ember or Backbone or React? But you know what? I heard a new framework's coming out next week, so scratch those off the list and learn that one instead. Cool. So we've submitted something to the server, but what is the server? We need to learn a language like PHP or Python or Ruby. Which one? You'll probably end up using all of them. Those are going to take you years and years to learn. Great, go ahead and do that. Okay, so now we want to persist this data, right? So we'll probably use SQL, but there's lots of options. So we need to learn that language, and that will take some time to learn as well. Cool. But now at this point, we still just, right above the doc type in your HTML, we're just doing all of our database queries with PHP, right? We can't do that. We need something that provides a little bit more structure. So let's learn a framework like Laravel or Symfony or CodeIgniter or whatever comes out next year. That will take years. Okay, so we don't want to reinvent the wheel, right? So we're going to use Composer, and we're going to go and use packages. So we're going to go to GitHub and try to figure out how to use those packages. Okay, that's good. Next, we're starting to feel good, but you know what? I'm going to bring you down a notch. Do you really understand object-oriented programming? Most of us learn how to create a person class, but it takes a long time to really understand what it means and this idea of messaging. Okay, so do you understand inheritance and composition and polymorphism and encapsulation and interfaces? Great job. Let's move on to something else. What about the command line, right? Jessica was talking about she doesn't really like to show others because she doesn't feel that comfortable with it. Totally understandable, but you got to learn it a little bit. Okay, we'll do that. Well, you know what? It would be nice if we had some version control, right? Because right now, when we finish a project, we just kind of create a backup and we call it project complete. And then we realize it's not complete, so we copy it and paste it and rename it to project complete for real this time. We don't want to do that, right? So we need to learn Git, and as we learned today, Git can actually be pretty complex. And next, we want to share our code, so we need to use GitHub and figure out all the jargon associated with that. Let's learn that. Next, Vim. We're working on our production server. At the very least, you need to understand some basic commands, and you need to understand that there's different modes when it comes to Vim. Excuse me, this is hard. But also, you may decide that you want that to be your main editor, right? I used Vim for many years. You will get a huge benefit from using it. Nonetheless, you need to understand the basics. Okay, next, well, Apache, Nginx, what's the difference? You're probably going to end up using both, so make sure you figure that out. And then what about when it comes to building up servers, right? That's kind of confusing. We want a virtual machine. This is hard. I don't know what I'm doing. Why don't we figure out Vagrant? Okay, but you know what? Vagrant's kind of hard, so it would be nice if we had a wrapper around Vagrant, like Homestead, to make this easier. Cool. Could we do the same thing for production? Sure, let's use Forge. All right, we're figuring all this out. Give me just a minute to catch my breath. We have a lot to cover. We got more to do. Okay, 2 more slides. MVC. Now, do you understand MVC, or do you understand kind of the web version of MVC, which actually isn't MVC, but does it matter? Who knows? Or what about MV star and every iteration of MV star? You need to figure those out, or you're not a professional developer. Okay, namespacing. Okay, it's kind of new to PHP. Do you totally understand it? Do you understand how that works with PSR4 autoloading? If not, take a minute and learn that. What about regular expressions? That's a whole language in itself. Do you understand the difference between a star and a plus and a question mark? You need to understand this, so that'll take many, many months. Go figure that out. What about testing? Ooh, you're not a professional developer unless you're testing, right? So you need to understand, well, which framework do you use, right? PHP Unit or PHP Spec or Codeception or Behat or some other tool I'm not thinking of right now? Make sure you at the very least, try out some of them, and the reality is you'll end up using a few of them. And we haven't even talked about the jargon that's associated with it, which is completely overwhelming. And the worst part is nobody actually agrees on what these terms mean. Okay, 5 years, easy. Design patterns, right? These are great. These are common solutions to common problems. The issue is when people try to apply them way too early. The reality is you want to refactor. You want to use design patterns to refactor. And if you decide, you know what, this actually isn't better, then you refactor away from them. That's how it works. But people try to apply them too early, and then they try to enforce them on others. Okay. Well, at the very least, you need to learn this stuff. Okay, what about security? Surely you're not storing passwords in clear text, right? I know a business that actually did that. I worked for that business. We'll talk about that later. Okay, what about architecture, right? I wasn't responsible for it, so it's okay. What about architecture? Everyone talks about architecture. We don't really know what it means. We just kind of have this basic idea. Take some time to learn that. That's going to take your whole career. Okay, what about command bus and CQRS and event storming and emergent design? This is all great stuff, but it takes a long time to learn. And then, you know, if you're going to go out on your own, you need to have a basic understanding of the UI. You don't have to be a designer, but you need to know what you're doing, right? So UX, user psychology, Chrome DevTools, you need to optimize performance. Okay, that will take quite a bit of work. Now, what about the acronym Avalanche, like PSRs and CRUD and REST and Active Record versus Data Mapper and ADR and TDD and BDD and DDD and DDD again and Solid, and then before you know it, the reality is everything I covered on that list doesn't amount to half of it. And we all know, like, that stuff is, you kind of need to learn it to some extent, right? And if you haven't gotten to some of those items, then you will in the next few years. And after you do your best, and you've been working at this for years upon years, you release some code, and of course, these kind of Reddit comments come up. Yeah, that's great, but does it scale? Scale? I know you said you know Solid, but I'm looking through your code, and your code does not follow Solid, so what are you doing? Why are you even a coder, right? This is hard, and people will just knock you down, right? This is a real quote. Stop building things your code doesn't follow SRP. That's a real quote on Reddit. Screw that guy, right? This is hard stuff, and when you release code, it's kind of a vulnerable thing, right? At least it is for me. I don't know how it is for you, but it feels like this, right? It feels that way to me. We're all completely vulnerable and open to influence because you can't possibly learn everything. So you're doing your best, and we think to ourselves, if only I can somehow conform to this doctrine and structure my code in that specific shape, finally, I'll have achieved maintainable and proper code, because that's all we want. There's this notion that some people are just contractors and don't give a shit, to be frank. And then there are these other people that want to do everything right, and that's not true. At the end of the day, all of us want to write good code, and we're just trying to do it as best as we can. And so much of this comes down to personality. I've really begun to learn that. But still, we want to know the true way. And we think if I can figure this out, maybe finally I won't feel so out of my league. Imposter syndrome will go out the window, and I will know exactly what I'm doing. That would be the one true way, and I will be a professional developer, and that will be great. And I've done this for 10 years, and everything just tells me that that idea of the right way to do it is complete BS, because it all depends upon context. And here's the worst part by far. Even if you follow all these rules, your future self is going to cringe at what you've written today. It's never not been the case. Have you ever looked at code you wrote 5 years ago and thought, wow, he nailed it? No, it's never happened because the industry moves so fast you can't keep up. The code I wrote 10 years ago, I can't even fathom what it looked like, right? Or here's another example. Consider this, CSS. Most CSS best practices of yore, 10 points to Gryffindor for using yore in a slide, are now complete anti-patterns. Think about that. You learned this in 2007, great job, but it was all wrong, right? Because we've decided, well, you know what? Some of those best practices may not be best practices. I'll give you an example. IDs, right? Back then, 2005 or so, back then, apply an ID to your HTML, and that way you can target it, and it doesn't affect the styling of anything else on your page. And use an ID that very much refers to the site that you're building, right, and what it refers to. People don't say that anymore. Now people are saying, well, you know what? That's not reusable. It's very much connected to the thing that it wraps. Instead, you should use classes more. In fact, you should use IDs very rarely. Another example would be the cascading nature of CSS. Everyone said that's the beautiful thing about CSS is its glorious cascading nature. And then, after years and years, people start to think, well, you know what? Maybe not. Maybe that's not so great. So best practices change. So when people kind of reference best practices all the time, it's like, what are you talking about? It keeps changing. Best practices are constantly evolving. So I think about this a lot, and I've decided if there's like some secret sauce, what would it be? Like, is there one, because that's all we want is everyone just wants to know what is the secret sauce to make $1 million, right? Or in our example, what's the secret sauce to be a good, respectable developer? It's got to come down to simplicity. When I think about it, just everything in life that is perfect usually boils down to something that's very simple. Everything from finance to your relationships to something as simple, quote unquote, as a perfect circle. And that's the interesting thing. Don't confuse simple with basic or easy. This is what a lot of people like to do. It's like, oh, that's great for tiny stuff, but for anything of size, you're going to fall apart. No, that's not true. Writing simple or simpler code is incredibly complex. And again, I say simpler because it entirely depends upon the context of what you're building. And sometimes the simpler option actually does involve a good bit of complexity, and that will pay off in the end. But in other times, that's not the case. Okay. So writing code, we've decided it's like extremely difficult. And when I think about this, it's what I've been working on my entire career, just trying to write clear code that I will respect in a few years. It takes hard work. And sometimes I fail, right? Sometimes I totally feel like Tom Hanks and You've Got Mail, right? Where you're like, why can't I get this? Do you ever like work on projects and you're having trouble with a thing and you're really mad at yourself because you should understand this, but you don't? And you get really frustrated with yourself because you're way too much of a senior developer to be screwing up on this area, right? Nobody says anything, so it's just me. But sometimes I get so frustrated where I want to do that, right? And that just means take a day off, you'll get it tomorrow. Okay. Let's get back to these themes, okay? It's frustrating, but we need to figure out just what we should strive for, or at least what I would strive for. We're going to talk about things I've learned from unrelated industries. I think this is very interesting. Taylor talked about this yesterday, where you take different industries and you figure out what can I learn from them and apply to this completely unrelated thing, like code. I'll show you a few examples of that. Next, I've learned so much from the Laravel user base specifically, people who get excited and write books and write articles. And it's interesting when you're attracted to a tool and a different person's attracted to a tool, it's good to learn from each other, right? So certainly I've learned from them. The developer evangelists. There's so much to learn. People who naturally do this for free, a lot of times they move in to it being a paying gig, but so many people will just naturally promote something for free. And I love to learn, like, what is it specifically that attracted you to this? And once again, how can I apply it to my own projects? And definitely, yeah, there's so much to learn from the haters. This always surprises me, right? I always think to myself, like, why do you hate this tool? It's a tool, right? It may not be your cup of tea, great, but why do you hate it? Why? And I remember one time on a podcast, it must have been the Laravel podcast, I said something along the lines of, do construction workers like battle each other over which hammer is better? And I said it because clearly the answer is no, they don't, right? So I win the conversation. As it turns out, a week later, I receive an email from a programmer who used to work in construction, and he said, yes, Jeff, they very much battle over these things, right? So maybe that's good to know. No matter what the industry, if you're really into it, people are just going to battle each other, and that's okay, right? Because nobody, like, we're not bringing out pitchforks here. At the end of the day, we all share more in common than we don't. But there's still a lot to learn from the people who really hate a tool. Why? And is there a specific reason for it? And can it teach you more about the type of developer you want to be? Okay, so let me show you a couple examples of care, but we're going to start without code. We're going to reach outside of software development. When I think about care, I think about like everything I like or things I'm really passionate about usually boils down to the fact that the creators put in a massive amount of care into it. There's something as simple as like a perfect Nintendo Zelda game. Those things are so special because they take 5 years to make. They have no bugs. They are perfect. Those are really special things, at least for me. When I think about a book, for example, has anyone here read The Martian? Wow, not many people. The Martian is amazing. The guy who wrote it, fun fact, used to be a programmer. And now he's, of course, a full-time writer. And what's interesting about that is it's so mathematical in that book. And the cool thing is so much of it is real. Like, he actually worked out these equations. He didn't have to. He could have made them up on the fly, and 99.9% of the readers would have no idea. But he didn't. He actually worked out everything, whether it's like, all right, Earth is talking to Mars, we need to figure out on what date that would be most optimal, and things of that nature. That's very interesting to me. So much care being put into something that most people don't notice. Pixar is another example. I think Pixar, they are brilliant. I think they finally hit that. You know, do you ever go back and watch kids' movies that you loved as a kid, and they're so bad, like you can't even get through 10 minutes of it? Pixar, it's like they've hit that chord where they make a kids' movie that the kids love and the adults love on a completely different level. Can you imagine the amount of work that goes into that to find that balance? And what's interesting about Pixar is one of the heads, John Lasseter, he's also directed a bunch of the movies, like Cars and stuff. He has this phrase that he says to the designers and developers and the people who work on these movies. He says, sand the underside of the drawers. I love this quote, sand the underside of the drawers. What exactly does that mean? The way I interpret it, at least, is focus on the things, once again, the things that we think don't matter, maybe matter the most. So in this case, why sand or paint the underside of the drawers? Nobody will ever see it. Don't waste your time on that, right? That's just stupid, right? That's a bad use of your time. Don't do that. And he says, do it. I think that's really interesting. And the way I interpret it is if you're focusing on this thing that doesn't matter, imagine the care that you're putting into the things that do matter. Maybe the things that don't matter most. Here's another example, Inception. I love this movie so much. Has anyone here seen Inception? Good, okay. No spoilers beyond what you would see in the trailers, okay? I think Inception is so good. If you just saw it once and you thought, okay, fine. If you think of the ending and you thought the ending was really important, it actually wasn't. Now, the cool thing about Inception is it is so much more complex than you probably think. It's so complex to the point that entire books have been written about it, where people just try to explain what the heck was going on in that movie. People love to debate this. And I think it's okay to share this with you because it's all ambiguous. There is no answer. So it's okay to show you what some of these people think. Now, in Inception, just a quick recap, it deals with this idea of people hacking into the minds of others and extracting information from them, or hacking into their dreams. So you can extract information from them that they wouldn't normally give to you, right, when they're awake. Very cool stuff. And when they're in these dreams, you can go multiple layers. So like geeks like me just think this is the coolest thing, right? You can go like a dream within a dream, and a dream within a dream within a dream, and time moves differently. So 10 years down here is like a week up here. I just think that's cool. I love movies where I have to research it for like weeks after it to fully understand it. And I'm going to show you the coolest thing that you probably never knew about Inception. Now, when they're hacking into these dreams, they play this song in their ears. So as they're dreaming, they play this song. And the way it works is when that song is finished playing, that is their cue that the dream is over. Their medication, that stuff is about to wear off, that's keeping them asleep, and they're about to wake up. Okay, so here's the cool stat. The length of that song that plays is 2 minutes and 28 seconds. Okay. The length of Inception, the movie, is 2 hours and 28 minutes and 0 seconds. This is not a mistake. And think about that. Basically, everyone who sees this movie doesn't know this stat, yet he still put care into it. He still took time to work this in, even though basically everybody will never notice. These are the sorts of things that really inspire me. And what does it mean? Maybe it means maybe it means the movie is over, so the dream is up. Maybe it means the guy was dreaming the whole time. Maybe it doesn't. Right? And that's why I'm okay not spoiling anything for you, because it's entirely ambiguous. And for any movie that deals with the concept of dreams, people love to debate, was he dreaming the whole time? Was this a dream? Was this? If you think of a movie like Total Recall, the exact same thing. Was he dreaming the whole time? It's fun, right? I'm very fascinated by the level of care that goes into something like this. I think it's really cool. In terms of code, what would that look like? Just focusing on things that seemingly don't matter, but they do matter. Maybe it's as simple as just things like beautiful comments, taking time to focus on things that literally no one else does, right? This is from your routes file. It's kind of like a letter to the user of the framework, right? Perfect flagpole comments, and anyone who's used Laravel for any period of time will know this format where each line is 3 characters fewer than the one that came before it. 3 lines, each line is 3 characters fewer than the one that came before it. And you see this everywhere in Laravel. In fact, you don't not see it anywhere in Laravel. It's followed everywhere from here to here. Quick note on this, actually. Some people would say like comments are an anti-pattern. And what they mean by this, and it's totally valid, what they mean by this is if you need to add a comment to explain what it is maybe some condition does, then what that means is you didn't describe it in your code and your API well enough. So instead, you should refactor, usually like take your condition, refactor it to a method that's readable, and then you make the comment redundant. That's great advice. What I've found though, especially in this case, I think that's the container class with Laravel, when you get to that low level, it's really complex stuff. So it just gets hard even when you do your best. And further, specifically for a framework, you have to explain this not just to yourself, but to every person who may want to contribute to the code base. So it's really important that you describe exactly what's going on here. I think that's wonderful. Here's another example. Here's a configuration file. Laravel has the best configuration files I've ever seen. I've used a lot of projects where you check out the configuration and you just can't understand it because it's very vague and you're trying to figure out what does this do and you just have to do trial and error. That's never happened with the Laravel configuration files. So this is something I completely stole and just applied to myself. You don't need to read this, it's just the idea of making it perfectly clear what it does for the users. It's putting the user first, in other words. Another example is as simple as just finding a way to import your classes and making it look as attractive as possible. It's so trivial, right? Yet on some level, I think it makes sense. I think it makes a difference on some microscopic level. As I was researching this, I was just Googling, and I found this Stack Overflow thread. I promise I just randomly found it. And it's dated July 8th, 2011. And as it turns out, Laravel was first, at least, committed to on GitHub in June. So this means I assume this is what he was working on. And quickly to paraphrase, he's basically saying, sometimes I just spend ridiculous amounts of time agonizing, that's a key word, over making code look pretty. And he's basically saying, I'll scan the file and I'll just see if anything kind of pokes out at me, and am I wasting my time, and am I being OCD? This is interesting to me, because when I look at Laravel, it very much seems like Taylor's OCD, and I think in the best possible way he is, right? I'm very thankful that he's somewhat OCD. But you know what? Maybe we all have to be that way. Here's the top reply to that. If you're spending that much time manually editing code, I'd be willing to guess you're not very challenged, because there's absolutely no reason for it. And he continues. Listen, man, it's good to have pride in your code, but not when it comes at the expense of being smart, so stop being so stupid, Taylor. It's basically what it translates to. It's very condescending, right? Now, what's interesting to me about that is he's right? And it's important to note, like, agonizing over code when you're on company time is like, that's kind of a different thing. So I totally get that. When you're on company time, you have different priorities, you have different commitments, you have to worry about those things. But when you're on your own projects and when you're working on your own open source, the rules can be a little bit different. So I do want to point that out. What's interesting to me about this reply, though, that everyone liked, it had 100 likes, I feel like they totally missed the point. And what's most interesting to me is the thing that most attracted me to the framework is the fact that some of these kind of OCD type things took place, right? And once again made me think, wow, he's putting so much care into this. I want to check out what else is going on here, right? So once again, the things that don't matter maybe matter most. Once again, we're sanding the underside of the doors. It doesn't matter, it doesn't make a difference, yet it does make a difference. Let me show you another example. It's a very basic controller from the Laravel 4 days, maybe some kind of flyer like a brochure. When you create a new flyer, you call flyer create, and you redirect the flyers. Okay. Fine, it's fine, basic project, it's okay. What's interesting, though, is when Laravel was being updated to version 5, as you may know, controllers became namespaced for the first time. So Laravel 5 introduced PSR4 autoloading. Controllers are now namespaced, which is great. But one worry I personally had as a user is, well, we have these Laravel facades, and some people hate them, but I kind of like them, to be honest. At least for the scope of what I build, I kind of like them. But now you would have to add a use, like in this case for the redirect, you'd have to say use redirect at the top in order to reference it. And you're probably thinking, like, who cares, Dev? It doesn't matter. If you use any IDE or editor worth its salt, you can do it automatically, right? It doesn't matter. Stop focusing on stuff that doesn't matter. That's the entire point, is like on some microscopic level, it matters, and you'll have to do that for any other reference you have to pull in. So I like to think of it in terms of like mental debt, right? We talk about technical debt, but I like to think of mental debt of just consuming a class. And every time you add just one more use statement, it adds like that much more mental debt. That's at least how I like to think of it. So I remember talking about it, and Taylor said, well, maybe add a redirect method on a parent class. This is pretty common in frameworks, and you reference that, and you're good to go, right? Yeah, that would be fine, but I don't think it's quite as good. It's the same, but it's not the same. It's not quite as good. So instead, a handful of global functions were redirected. Gasp, global functions, the world's going to end. I think it's okay. I think it's kind of awesome, right? I think it looks good. It's not for everything, but it looks good. That's how we solved that. And once again, it's an example of making user happiness the first priority, even at a microscopic level, in terms of agonizing over just like, how does this feel? Will I be annoyed when I have to use this? Yeah, a little bit, so maybe can I agonize over this and find a way to make it just a little more user-friendly? And so many people would say it's bad. So many people would say it's bad. And I feel like, once again, sometimes incredibly smart people, including all of us, including me, have the ability to offer really bad advice. Because, like Everset noted, so much of it is dependent upon the scope of what we are personally building. And we forget that other people have just entirely different requirements, right? So you have to be careful about that. It's okay, once again, to be honest about the scope of what we're building. I think that's really important. Or in other words, the only truly dangerous thing is our ability to be disgracefully overconfident about the things that we barely understand. That's one thing that annoys me, is when people are so incredibly confident about saying that this is so much better than this. And when you ask them, like, why is this better, usually it ends up being pretty abstract. Usually it's like, well, if you look at page 123 here, then it shows, once again, that you're not supposed to do this, so why are you doing that, right? It all just ends up like people regurgitating from what they read in a book 6 months ago. That's at least how it feels to me. Theme 2, simplicity. We're starting to figure out kind of like, once again, I'm trying to figure out what would be special about Laravel that makes it so incredibly popular. Years ago, I think less than 100 people went to a Laracon. Now we have way more than that. What is it about it that attracts it? And how can I, once again, apply that to my own projects? And I think it ultimately boils down to beautifully simple APIs that put the user first. The types where like you read a page of documentation, you got it. You understand exactly how to use it. Think how rare that is. At least for me, it's like, I want to use this, and it's so complicated. With some of these components, with Laravel, it's like, okay, got it. Read some documentation, that makes sense. I'd never used queues in my life, but now I suddenly know how to do it because somebody cared enough about me to make it that much easier to consume. Very interesting. So when you wonder like why people seem like crazy excited about something, right? When it's like, oh, geez, back off, it's a tool. Why are you so excited about this? Usually it boils down to the fact that they've been trying to figure this out and they couldn't do it. And then finally they find some kind of tool or some kind of library where it just makes sense, right? And there's so many examples of this. The Faker library, the intervention library, where just things just make sense. It's so nice when you find an author who understands the user. Simple, natural, intuitive APIs. And when I think about myself, that's one of my biggest mistakes, right? Is I'm building something and I'm focusing so much on the solution. I just need to figure out, like, I have to do this and this and this to get it to work. And I'm focusing so much on that end, and I'm giving no attention whatsoever to how it feels to use. And is it any wonder when I finally get it to work that it just sucks, right? Because I didn't think about that. I was just focused on the solution, not how it feels. Laravel has so many of these in recent memory, or at least as much as we can cover in this talk, Scheduler and Laravel Cashier. We're going to go through these very quickly. They're not to teach you them, they're just to show you just how nice and natural they are. If I want to, every single day at 11:59, trigger an Artisan Commands, that's basically what I want. Just notice it reads exactly the way you would want it to. Or if I want to execute a terminal command. Or maybe it's something as simple as I just want to delete some ancient user events in my database or something. Pretty simple. Call this every month. That's exactly what you would want. So you write the API, and you describe in a perfect world how would it feel to interact with this, and then you just write the code to make that doable. And what annoys me most about this guy is he's the one who made it, right? He just holds hot dogs and writes code, right? It's kind of annoying, right? I had to get him back for the bunny thing. You guys don't like it. Okay, another example would be Cashier, right? We've already covered this, but it's when we get beyond our ideas of what write code is and how it should be, this is kind of what you would want, right? If I just want to create a subscription, that's what I want, right? So write the code and make it work. Or what about when you need a coupon? Well, we don't call it set coupon, we use with coupon because that's more natural. That's how you would speak it, and then you make it work. If I want to swap to a different subscription, then why don't we have a method called swap, right? It's amazing how just natural and obvious this is, and when we try to implement these things on our own, it's just so hard. At least for me, it's like, I think I've made it simple, and then I realize down the line, like, God, you weren't even close. You were so far. This is so complex. It's agonizing over making things as simple and natural and intuitive as possible, and that's why people get excited, because it's really hard, and most people can't do it. And when you find a handful of people who can just make your life easier, you get excited, right? Like Riker. Here's how you would download an invoice. And a quick aside on that, actually, a lot of people would say that's really bad form, right? Or a lot of people would say, in this particular case, the invoice class executes a little shell script or something, and we can't have that because that violates SRP, and we can't do that, so we need to call each other out on Twitter to let them know how screwed up and how bad they are, right? This just annoys me. Can we just please, for the love of God, stop calling each other out on Twitter and making each other... Do we wonder why we all have some of these issues, right? And so many of the people I talk to, they kind of feel the same way. Is you're constantly being called out when you're just trying to do good work, right? And it's like design pattern violation. Who says that? It's not a violation. They're ideas. They're options, right? I love this quote. It's perhaps impossible to avoid being patterns happy on the road to learning patterns. It's very true for me. Might be for you. So once again, we're just focusing on what these books say, and we're focusing on purity and architecture, or whatever that means, and we're not focusing on just user happiness and simplicity. I'll show you another example. This came out after the previous Laracon. Somebody wrote this in their blog, and they were complaining that this was so bad. Once again, you don't know what the context is. You don't know what this project is, so how is it bad, right? And of course, what he was suggesting is this is the proper way to do it, right? Instead, well, let's go one at a time. User find or fail. Okay, there's a good argument to be made that you can wrap that in a repository. It gives you a lot of flexibility. You can decorate it, especially for reads when you're using Eloquent. That's actually pretty useful. But okay, So we're going to switch that over to a user repository. But you know what? User repository isn't a concrete class because we can't do that. We learned we have to flip the dependencies. So instead, user repository is an interface, and then we create an implementation, and then we bind that implementation to the interface, and then we inject it. OK, so now we're doing better, right? Here's another. Return view, that's just a simple helper function where we load a view. No, we can't have that. We need to isolate. So instead, we inject the view factory into the controller. And once again, flip the dependencies. It has to be an interface, right? So that's what we're going to do. And now in the show profile method, this is the right way to do it. I guarantee there's a lot of people in this room who would say, yeah, that's way better. Once again, it depends upon context. But let's just break it down. Is this better than this? Because when I look at this, just in the fact that the text is so much larger in this slide, but is this better? It's definitely testable. It's definitely testable. You could unit test this so easily. So yeah, OK. Is that the only metric, though? Is this better? Kind of like that, right? My wife doesn't know anything about code. She could read this. She would kind of understand it. It's interesting. What I would say about this is you have to fight for it. I sometimes say guilty until proven innocent about these things. You have to really fight for why you need this. And if you have a good argument, then great. You should do this approach because your project requires it. But otherwise, as a default, this, I think, is pretty good. I don't think it's that bad. But once again, this is the proper way to do it. OK, so that brings us to our next theme, distrust. And it kind of leads into this one. Be open. We should all be open. You should take in as much as you possibly can, but there's no choice but to have a healthy level of distrust, right? You need to be convinced. And I'm going to show you an example of this using Laravel Elixir, which I helped build. Many people thought, and maybe still do think that Laravel Elixir was like a really stupid idea. They would say, why is Laravel including this? Just use grunt or gulp. Well, don't be stupid once again. Don't do this. If we had listened to them, this wouldn't exist, and I think it's kind of cool for a lot of projects. Once again, it's not for everything, but it's not supposed to be for everything, right? That can't be your metric for everything. Your metric should be like the 80% use case or the 70% use case. Now, why does Elixir exist? Well, I'll show you a tweet from today from Remy Sharp. If you're not familiar with him, he's a JavaScript developer, and very well known, in fact. And he was saying today, whenever I say you don't need the complexity in building sites, I'm always asked about, well, how do you minify and prefix and version and all of these other things? And he went on and he said, the time taken to just add a couple CSS vendor prefixes is way, way faster than the time required to add the build tools to automate. And he's right, right? We sometimes forget, like, yeah, the build tool will automate it, but you are going to spend hours upon hours upon hours learning this tool and researching it. You know you do. Gulp is so great. It's a lot easier than grunt in my mind, and it still takes a long time to learn how to configure this stuff. I think Elixir should exist because of these two tweets. Because you know what? It's not faster to add those prefixes than it is to use Elixir. Here's your main Gulp file in a Laravel app. And I'm proud of this because we worked really hard to get it like this. Here's how you would use it. And what I love about this is just think. At the end of the day, this is what you want. You end up having to write this for most projects, right, with Gulp. And Gulp is great, by the way. Elixir is a wrapper around Gulp, but Gulp is fantastic. But still, you create that. And you copy and you save it to a gist because you just copy and paste it to every project you're working on. And it doesn't really describe it. It's just thinking in terms of the solution. Well, I have to do this, and 500 lines later, I'm done, and I have to research it. And once again, this has nothing to do with what I'm building, but I just have to put energy into this, right? This is what I want. I just want to compile Sass. I like browserify. I just want to cache bus some files. That's what I want. Yet I end up writing this. So I'm going to show you how we went about building this. This was an initial idea. No production code had been written, but we thought, OK, maybe a config object. OK, that might work. And then Taylor submitted this one to me. And now what's interesting about this is that it says straw.sit. This is maybe the number one thing I've learned from Laravel, is this single thing. I've never told him this. Straw.sit, zero production code had been written, but it was already being branded. Laravel Straw. Now, I honestly think now it's kind of silly, but still, it was being branded before any code had been written. It was being given a name. And is it any wonder when you use Laravel and it just feels like so well-branded, right? So many of the different tools and packages, it just feels like, wow, like this is really nicely branded. It's because it's being focused on at step one instead of once you finish the project. I think that's really interesting. So we decided we have to do this. We went to work on it. I had the wonderful idea that I would call the argument please. And I would say, please use less and run these tests, good sir. Right? That was a great contribution. I'm joking, by the way. You guys don't laugh much. Okay, so we got it to this point. Yeah, it's getting there. It's still like, if we're thinking about mental debt, that area at the bottom, tasks, wish we could get rid of that. And then please combine scripts. And then we're adding the full path from the project root. If we agonize over it, I think we can make it better. So instead, we were able to get rid of the tasks at the bottom. So if we can get that away from the user, that mental debt is no longer there. Great. And so we were still worrying about the API because it just didn't feel right. So Taylor said, let me type it in a file and see what it looks like. And this is exactly the way it should be, right? Whether you're using something like PHP spec and you're starting from scratch, or you're just creating an empty file and you're seeing how would this feel to interact with. And is it any wonder that when you start with that step, it turns out so much better? And once again, I continued with great recommendations, like we call the argument, So we say straw.sip, I taste sass. I'm very wise. No, I'm just kidding. So straw wasn't right, but it got us on the idea of thinking of drinks or a wine or potion, and eventually it got branded as Laravel Elixir. And I'm very proud of this because it was so hard to get to that point. Or in other words, agonizing over just making that as natural and intuitive as possible, always pays off, I think. And most people don't agonize over it, and it's pretty obvious. But yeah, plenty of people just felt that Laravel Elixir was kind of stupid and then dangerous, that common keyword, and I'm glad we didn't listen to them. As soon as we released Elixir, this was posted on Twitter. Once again, these people just exist. It's a shame. You know, you want to say, like, you guys got to go, right? You just can't be involved because you can't play well with others. Laravel thinks developers are too stupid to learn Gulp. Because clearly that's what we thought. We thought everyone is too stupid to learn Gulp, so we have to make it easier. No, it's not even remotely true. It was in response to those tweets that Remy Sharp made, because that is completely true. It's a lot of work. And especially if you don't work in that area, it's a lot of work. And we have other things to be focusing on. We're trying to build a product here. The code is a way to get us there, but at the end of the day, hopefully, we're trying to build a business and a product here. That's the number one thing. The code is just a way to get us there. So can we make it just a little more natural? Once again, really smart people can offer really bad advice, and they do it sometimes in an arrogant way where they kind of make you feel like I can't understand why you would do this, right? That's kind of how they make you feel. It's okay. All right, let's finish up. You guys are ready for me to be done. Things I strive for: care, really focusing on care, and things that you think don't matter, maybe they do, right? Focusing on simplicity, and simplicity as it relates to the scope of what you're building, right? And that will be very different depending upon what you're building. So it's important to just always ask yourself, is this the most clear way I could build this? And then, yes, obviously, distrust, a healthy level of distrust. That doesn't mean go into your corner and just decide this is what you do and everything else you'll push away. No, let all of it in, but have a healthy level of distrust. So what's unimportant is paramount. Simpler always wins. We have so many examples in terms of popularity. The tool that's just a little more natural, that favors the user a little bit more, wins in terms of popularity every single time. And this goes in with that idea of favoring the API over purity, being honest about the scope of what we're building and what the requirements are, and focusing on the fundamentals. This is huge. Go back and really learn those fundamentals that you think you know, but you might find that you didn't learn them as well as you think. And then, yeah, let's just build things. That's all we're here for. You're going to get better. We can't be terrified of release code. Just build things, release it, do it as best as you can. You're going to get better. You're going to do another project. That's the way it goes for all of us. But yeah, trust no one, including me. These are just my ideas alone, unless they are also yours. Thank you.